Loving God, open our hearts to hear your word. Set our hearts on fire with love for you. Stir our hearts to do your work in the world. Amen. Well, at long last, we have reached the promised land. For the last 10 Sundays in a row, we have journeyed along with Moses and the people of Israel. From the end of August, when we heard about Moses' birth, to God calling to Moses out of that burning bush with the directive to go and set God's people free. We've heard the stories of Pharaoh's intransigence, even when faced with increasingly severe plagues, until he finally conceded and let God's people go, only to quickly change his mind and corner them on the shores of the Red Sea. We have heard the many trials and the many complaints of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. And we have heard the ways that God provided for them at every step along the journey. The people of Israel weren't perfect. Moses wasn't perfect. They screwed up along the way time and time again. And time again, when God would get angry, Moses would intercede on behalf of the people, reminding God that God's essential nature is to be merciful. And as we hear in this reading at the end of Deuteronomy, the very end of the Torah, Moses is 120 years old at the end of this journey. It's been a long time coming. He can look back and see his life's work stretched out behind him. And he stands on the top of the mountain with God. And God shows him the promised land, the finish line. All of the hard work and the suffering and trusting in God has all been leading up to this moment in this place. It is a moment of triumph, surely. God stands there with Moses, looking out over all of the land, and God says to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." And then Moses, the servant of God, died there in the land of Moab. He dies right there at the finish line? When he can taste God's triumph, his triumph. He has endured with the people of Israel and arrived at the doorstep of the promised land, and he dies. This is not how the story of an epic journey is supposed to end. I mean, Odysseus arrives home, and he sets things right. Frodo and Sam and the hobbits destroy the ring and make it back to Hobbiton. Harry Potter vanquishes Voldemort and lives in peace. We want them to have a happy ending. Isn't that what the people in these stories deserve? Isn't that what we deserve? After so many trials and tribulations, this just doesn't seem fair. Couldn't Moses, couldn't God have held on just a little bit longer so that Moses could taste the fruits of his labor? But he doesn't. And we are left with this story that is, to my ears, heartbreaking and somehow, at the same time, it is incredibly heartening. Because this is a story we recognize. This is a story that resonates in our bones, because this is how our stories end more often than not. Not with a happy ending, all of the strands neatly tied up. Instead, they often end like this: incomplete, unfinished, with work left for the next generation to pick up. But this doesn't have the same satisfying ring as "and they all lived happily ever after." Yet it does have a ring of truth. We don't always get to finish our life's work. We have never, not one of us, seen the completion of God's redemptive work in and through our lives on this side of heaven. But that's not the promise, is it? God calls us to hard and holy work. God equips us to do our part in it, walks alongside us, and empowers us. But God never tells us that we will see the end of the journey in this lifetime. Zena Jackie, a pastoral assistant at the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church over in Alexandria, writes, "Beloved, you and I were not put on this earth or called to work in the kingdom to complete every single task for which we are equipped or to which we are called. We are ministers and men and women who serve, not messiahs. We are cooperators and contributors who do our best, but we are not Christ. We are not destined to complete it all." We need only take a cursory glance around our world to know that the journey, that God's redemptive work isn't finished. God's dream of perfect peace hasn't been fully achieved yet. God's liberating, life-giving love hasn't yet fully transformed the systems of the world, the systems of our own making that prevent everyone from growing and thriving and living in God's perfect freedom. We need look no further than the devastating images and stories emerging from the Holy Land in recent weeks. The blood of innocents flowing in the streets, Israeli blood and Palestinian blood, human blood, all shed at the altar of a seemingly intractable conflict. We see it in the news this week of 18 lives cut tragically short in Maine, victims of human brokenness. We see it in the suffering of so many longing to live in the glow of God's loving presence, but who are kept trapped in chains of darkness and suffering. It feels so discouraging and disheartening. It feels like a quagmire with no way out. We can say with near certainty that none of us will see the end of these conflicts in our lifetime. We make progress step by step, but war and hatred and violence and selfishness and brokenness remain. So what do we do? It's tempting to walk away, to throw our hands up in the air and say, I will tend to myself and my loved ones and my problems, and shut out all these things that are simply too big for me to solve. I mean, if even Moses didn't live to see the end, why should we bother? But that's not what God calls us to either. God calls us not to complete all of the work, but to complete our part of the work. We are called to faithfully take the steps that we can take, and then trust. Trust that those who come behind us, our children who look to our example of how to faithfully follow God, we trust that they will do their part in carrying on the work. Moses mentored Joshua, prepared him not to become the next Moses, but to faithfully be Joshua and do the work that God had laid out for Joshua. It says it perfectly in that cinematic classic, Frozen 2. Just do the next right thing. Take a step, step again. It is all that I came to do, the next right thing. I won't look too far ahead. It's too much for me to take. But break it down to this next breath. This next step, this next choice is the one that I can make. When we look at the problems of the world, it is overwhelming. We ask ourselves, what can I possibly do? And it's this: to take one step, and then the next step, and then the next, until our part in the work is completed. It is simply to do the next right thing, to love God and love ourselves, and most importantly, to love our neighbor. As it concludes in Frozen 2, so I'll walk through this night, stumbling blindly toward the light, and do the next right thing. And with the dawn, what comes then, when it's clear that everything will never be the same again? Then I'll make the choice to hear that voice and do the next right thing. Amen.